The first thing he did after his reincarnation was to dig like a frenzied mole, burrowing deep into the earth. He carved out a tunnel 3 meters deep. This was because in his previous life he had been far too ostentatious. In the dead of night, a demonic cultivator had broken in and refined him into a human pill, leaving not even a trace of his remains behind. Having been reborn, he would rather feign being useless for his entire life than ever draw attention to himself again. Consequently, he not only spread deadly toxins throughout the tunnel but also concealed activated spikes within its depths. Should any blind demonic cultivator dare to step foot into his dwelling, they would be ruthlessly counter-killed and transformed into mere fertilizer for his flowers. Deep within the mine, sparks flew through air thick with the heavy scent of gunpowder and damp earth. Yet Chenzhou gripped his refined iron pickaxe, his arms aching and trembling uncontrollably. Gritting his teeth, he swung his arms in a wide arc, slamming the pickaxe against the unyielding stone. A powerful recoil traveled up from the wooden handle, numbing the webs of his thumbs until they felt as though they would tear apart. Sweat mingled with lime dust and flowed into his eyes, stinging them fiercely, yet he did not even dare to wipe it away. He could only act like a heartless machine, mechanically swinging the pickaxe, for he knew deep down, he absolutely could not stop. In this wretched place where the sun never shone, stopping meant being whipped, starved, or even losing one's life. Even now, Ye Chenzhou's mind remained somewhat dazed. Only 3 days ago, he was a mere salaryman working late nights. In the blink of an eye, he had transmigrated into this cruel world of cultivation. He did not become a peerless genius, nor did he have an ancient master to guide him. Instead, he was cast as the lowest-level spirit mine laborer of the heavenly profound sect. Here he possessed neither human rights nor status. In the eyes of the cultivators, they were worth less than the dogs kept by the sect. They were merely pure disposable resources. His daily task was to mine low-grade spirit stones day and night without rest in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. Failure to meet the mining quota resulted in a beating at best, or being deprived of food. At worst, one would be thrown into the back mountains to serve as fodder for demonic beasts. Suddenly, a sound echoed from not far away, followed by an agonizing scream like that of a slaughtered pig. Overseer Zhao Tishan approached, wielding a black spiked leather whip. He hurled insults as he walked, his face twisted in a fierce, brutal expression. Although he was only at the 3rd level of chi refining before these mortal laborers, he was a veritable living Yama. Nearby, a frail laborer who could truly endure no more leaned against the cavern wall, gasping for breath, and inadvertently drew the overseer's ire. Without a second word, Zhao Tieshan lashed out with his whip. The laborer's thin hemp robe was instantly shredded. A deep gash, exposing the bone, was carved into his back, and he collapsed to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. That frail servant ignored the bone-piercing pain, scrambling on all fours to snatch up his pickaxe, gasping for air while weeping and begging for mercy, swearing that he would resume digging immediately. He dared not be lazy for another second. The surrounding servants were so terrified they dared not even breathe loudly. Those who had intended to beg for mercy quickly swallowed their words. Every one of them lowered their heads and worked with desperate intensity. Yi Chenzhou stole a glance, his heart thumping wildly, but he immediately withdrew his gaze, his face remaining expressionless, his breathing steady like an emotionless mining machine. In this cannibalistic world of cultivation, showing off without the strength to back it up was nothing short of seeking death. His rule for survival was simple: keep your head down, work, and never cause trouble. Zhao Tishan, whip in hand, walked past Yi Chenzhou's back. Seeing the pile of crushed ore at his feet and his steady composure, he noted the youth was as stable as an old hound. Satisfied, he gave a cold snort and strode arrogantly toward the next mining area. Only when the footsteps had completely faded into the distance did Yi Chenzhou's tense back finally relax. Taking advantage of a moment to catch his breath, Ye Chenzhou silently focused his mind, and a translucent pale blue screen that only he could see appeared. This was his only trump card since his reincarnation, the attribute extraction panel. The interface was incredibly simple, with no shop, no sound, only a few lines of text. Host, E-cultivation. Mortal. Available attribute points. Its function was simple and direct. As long as his hand touched a living or dead object, he could extract the target's attributes and fuse them perfectly into his own body. When he first discovered its golden finger, Yi Chenzhou was so excited he nearly jumped for joy, wishing he could immediately grab a low-grade spirit stone, extract its spiritual energy, and ascend on the spot. However, he forced himself to exercise restraint. According to the original owner's memories, the Tianquan sect managed spirit stones with extreme strictness. Every single stone underwent 3 rounds of inspection. If he touched a spirit stone and it turned into a useless rock the next moment, Zhao Tishan would surely hack him into 100 pieces. The first to stand out is the first to fall. Only by remaining hidden could he hope to prevail. For these past 3 days, he had resisted temptation and obediently served as a laborer, all to find an absolutely safe target for extraction. Suddenly, the sound of the bronze gong signaling the end of the shift echoed throughout the mine. The laborers felt as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Casting aside their pickaxes, they collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Afterward, they formed a long queue, hauling their heavy baskets of ore to the sorting area to submit their daily quota. Ye Chenzhou blended into the crowd. The amount of ore he delivered met the standard exactly, neither outstanding nor lacking, a perfect facade of mediocrity. Once their duties were fulfilled, the laborers swarmed toward the kitchens like a disturbed hive, desperate for a meal. Yet, Ye Chenzhou remained rooted to the spot, unmoving. His gaze was locked onto the massive waste pit in the corner of the sorting area. Piled high like a mountain within the pit was discarded iron ore, residue that was both incredibly hard and devoid of spiritual energy, shunned even by mortal blacksmiths. In the eyes of the sect, it was nothing more than worthless rubbish. Every evening, workers would haul it away to be dumped behind the mountain. Absolutely no one spared a second thought for the fate of this refuse. Taking a deep breath, Chenzhou gripped a large broom and strode toward the 2-meter-high mound of discarded slag. He feigned the simple task of cleaning. With no one in sight and the recording steward having long since retired to his quarters for tea, he was alone. Casting the broom aside, he pressed his right hand firmly against a jagged, pitch-black piece of iron slag the size of a human head. He let out a low growl in his mind, commanding the system panel to initiate extraction. A faint blue light screen flickered into existence, discarded iron slag detected. Extractable attribute, hardness. Without a moment's hesitation, Chenzhou confirmed the extraction. Suddenly, a powerful suction force surged from his palm. That once solid piece of iron slag instantly lost its luster. It crumbled within his grasp, disintegrating into a pile of ash-gray powder that scattered across the ground. The panel announced, extraction was successful. Overwhelmed with excitement, Chenzhou's blood boiled as he plunged both hands directly into the mountain of iron slag. The system's notifications chimed incessantly. In less time than it takes for an incense stick to burn, the slag before him turned to ash at a visible rate. A massive section of the discard pile had been reduced to mere dust. His hardness attribute skyrocketed to 100 points. He abruptly withdrew his hands. Any longer, and the entire pile would have collapsed, a phenomenon he could never hope to explain to others. He used his feet to grind the powder into the mud, meticulously erasing all traces of his actions. Silently, Chenzhou commanded the fusion, channeling all 100 points of the hardness attribute into the skin of his entire body. A bone-chilling sensation erupted from his heart, surging through his veins and his skin felt as though it were being pierced by countless ice needles. There was no pain, yet the tension reached an absolute extreme. The tissue beneath his skin felt as if it were being infused with high-density liquid metal, twisting and binding tightly with his muscle fibers. After a dozen breaths, the strange sensation vanished entirely. Chenzhou pinched his own arm. The sensation was now fundamentally different. His once ordinary flesh was now as tough as century-old hide. Even pinching with all his might failed to leave the slightest white mark. He picked up a jagged shard of stone and slashed it forcefully across the back of his hand. The sharp stone glided over his skin as if it were scraping against a plate of solid iron, leaving behind only a faint, shallow white scratch, which vanished completely with a light rub of his thumb. Chenzhou could not help but draw a cold breath. This was merely the lowest tier attribute found within the scrap pile. By stacking 100 points, he had achieved a body impervious to blades and spears. Should he stack even more, Zhao Tishan's whip would likely shatter upon impact. Suppressing the excitement in his heart, he cleaned the area, brushed the dust from his clothes, and hurried toward the kitchen. With this hardness attribute as his foundation, he finally possessed a modicum of security to survive in this world of cultivators. Early the next morning, the piercing ring of the brass bell resounded once more, herding all the laborers back into the mines. The conditions in Mining Area 4 were even worse. Water seeped constantly from the stone walls, and the ground was a morass of thick mud. Chenzhou raised his heavy, refined iron pickaxe high and brought it down forcefully upon the rock face. As the loud impact echoed, his eyes suddenly lit up. The recoil that had caused his bones to ache so intensely the day before was now being completely absorbed by an invisible cushion. He felt no pain whatsoever. Instead, the newfound density in his arms seemed to increase his strength. His pickaxe blurred into afterimages, doubling his mining efficiency. He intended to finish his task early, conserving his stamina to continue extracting attributes later that night. Just as he was focused on excavating a large boulder, a faint cracking sound suddenly echoed from above. An elderly laborer nearby let out a terrified scream, shouting that the tunnel was collapsing. Chenzhou snapped his head up to see a massive slab of rock, weighing several hundred pounds, break free from the ceiling. It plummeted toward his head with a deafening whistle. The space was too narrow and the ground beneath him was treacherous mud. There was nowhere to dodge. In that hairbreadth moment of life and death, Chenzhou reflexively raised his refined iron pickaxe. He braced it before him just as the massive rock slammed violently into the thick iron shaft. A terrifying force of impact exploded instantly. Even the handle, forged from refined iron, was bent nearly in half by the sheer weight. The heavy, sharp pickaxe head flew out of control, rebounding in midair with violent force directly toward Chenzhou's hand. The distance was too short, the speed too great. The surrounding laborers stared in wide-eyed terror, but a second later, the expected bloody scene failed to manifest. The pickaxe slammed heavily against Chenzhou's arm, yet no blood flowed. Instead, the crisp sound of metal clashing rang out as thick dust billowed within the mine. The old laborer nearby fell into the mud in fright, unable to regain his composure for a long time. Taking advantage of the obscuring dust, Chenzhou swiftly pulled his arm back into his sleeve. He shook his wrist. Forget a serious injury, not even a sliver of skin was broken. The impact felt as though he had merely been tapped by a wooden stick. He was inwardly astonished by the sheer power of his attributes, but he immediately feigned a look of lingering shock on his face. Rolling back 2 steps as he retreated, he deliberately threw the broken pickaxe far away. The old laborer stammered that he was truly fortunate to be alive. Had that impact landed properly, his arm surely would have been reduced to mangled flesh. Yi Chenzhou gave a foolish smile, claiming he was lucky to have only suffered a minor scrape. He casually grabbed a handful of dust and smeared it on the back of his hand, pretending to bandage his wound, and in this manner he deceived those around him. A few days passed, and the day of the monthly assessment at the labor peak soon arrived. In the open courtyard of the main estate stood a dozen large black wooden chests. Overseer Zhao Tishan sat upon a grandmaster chair, rotating 2 jade stones in his palm, flanked by several fierce-looking law enforcement disciples. The steward called out Qian Yufu's name in a loud voice before announcing his results. 80 caddies of low-grade spirit ore, exceeding the quota. Reward, half an origin gathering pill. Cheers of admiration immediately erupted from the crowd. Beaming with joy, Qian Yufu stepped forward quickly. As he received the half-pill, Yu Chenzhou watched the scene clearly. As Qian Yufu stepped down, the eyes of the old laborers nearby turned like those of hungry wolves fixed intently on the pill in his pouch. Yu Chenzhou knew well that in this dog-eat-dog world, flaunting one's wealth was tantamount to seeking death. Soon the steward called Yi Chenzhou's name. Carrying his basket of ore, he approached the wooden chest with his head bowed and emptied its contents. The disciple in charge of the weighing glanced at the scale and tonelessly announced, 50 caddies of low-grade spirit ore. Just barely meeting the standard, he was only granted a single caddy of the lowest grade inferior spirit rice. Zhao Taishan didn't even bother to lift an eyelid, a useless handyman of this caliber merely scraping by to meet the quota. Unremarkable and error-free, the overseer didn't even have the motivation to spare a single insult. Yi Chenzhou respectfully accepted the withered bag of spirit rice, bowing low as he retreated into the deepest shadows of the crowd. The other handymen who had been observing him immediately averted their gazes in disdain upon seeing the pathetic contents of his bag. Internally, Yi Chenzhou sneered. This was exactly as it should be. What he desired most was this complete lack of presence to be utterly forgotten. In recent days, it wasn't that he couldn't mine more ore. Rather, he had deliberately crushed the surplus and discarded it into the waste pit. If one cannot even keep their life, what use is half a chi-gathering pill? In the dead of night, the communal bunkhouse of the laborer peak echoed with snoring as loud as thunder. Yi Chenzhou's eyes suddenly snapped open. Like a black cat, he rolled off his bed and crept along the walls, slipping out of the courtyard undetected. He did not head toward the usual waste pit where he discarded his ore. He had already scouted a different location over the past few days. Following a secluded path behind the laborer peak, he made his way to the waste ravine of Danha Peak. The area was piled high with charred, blackened pill dregs emitting a thick, acrid stench. These were the remnants of failed pill refinements, saturated with violent fire poison and foul impurities. Anyone foolish enough to use this waste for cultivation would surely suffer ruptured meridians and die from body explosion by the following day. But to Yi Chenzhou, this was an unguarded mountain of gold. Crouching before the pile of discarded dregs, he rubbed his hands together and thrust them deep into the smoldering, scorched debris. In his mind, he commanded the interface to initiate the extraction process. A pale blue light screen manifested instantly before his eye. Detect successful, pill remnants with extractable attributes found, containing fire poison and a trace amount of spiritual ki. Yi Chenzhou's eyes lit up. His golden finger could indeed filter impurities automatically. He immediately ordered the system to extract only the spiritual chi. The notifications from the interface flashed incessantly. Those discarded pill dregs lost their final glimmers of light. They withered into a pile of odorless white powder. Strands of spiritual chi, pure to the extreme and devoid of any impurities, began to flow. They surged through his arms, flooding into his limbs and every meridian of his body. Like a torrential rain falling upon parched earth, his withered meridians rapidly expanded under the washing of this pure spiritual ki. They became brimming with vitality and resilience. There was no need for intentional guidance. The spiritual energy extracted by the panel directly infused his body, automatically transforming into the most fundamental cultivation foundation. His bones let out a series of crisp cracks, and within his once empty dantian, a fist-sized vortex of energy rapidly condensed. It spun with increasing velocity. After fully absorbing the spiritual energy, Yi Chenzhou's cultivation quietly broke through to the second level of chi refining. However, he immediately used the panel to suppress and lock his external aura. The next morning, the first thing Yi Chenzhou did upon opening his eyes was access the panel. He firmly suppressed his aura, making it appear as though he were only at the early stage of the first level of chi refining. To be even more cautious, he intentionally made his aura appear unstable and weak. He looked like a malnourished, frail weakling who could drop dead at any moment. After a brief wash, he pushed open his drafty, rotting wooden door. The handyman quarters were already as chaotic as a bustling marketplace. Several handymen who had received their monthly stipends the day before were gathering in small groups. Standing in the center of the crowd, Qian Yufu suddenly let out a shout as an orange flame, barely the size of a fist, flickered into existence in his palm. He smugly announced that this was the flame bullet technique, which he had just obtained from the outer sect deacon the previous day. The surrounding handymen immediately broke out in a chorus of flattery. They remarked that since he had already mastered a spell, he was guaranteed to pass next month's assessment and enter the outer sect. Yet, before the praise could even finish, the flame flickered weakly twice and died out completely. Yi Chenzhou walked past carrying a battered water bucket, not sparing them even a single glance. To him, flashy techniques like the flame bullet or water arrow were nothing more than death warrants. If one encountered an enemy in the middle of the night and spent ages chanting an incantation, only for a blinding orb of light to suddenly illuminate their hand, It would be no different than pinning a note to one's forehead and shouting, "Come and kill me." Using attacks with such special light effects only ensured the enemy knew exactly where to strike. In this cultivation world, where the strong prey on the weak, the number of people who vanished every day far exceeded the number of stray dogs on hard labor peak. Yi Chenzhou had long ago etched the philosophy of concealment into his very marrow. He resolutely avoided flashy displays. The less he stood out and the more invisible he remained, the longer he would survive. Setting down his water bucket, Yi Chenzhou made his way to the most secluded library pavilion on hard labor peak. This dilapidated place was usually devoid of even a single soul. The jade slips and tattered books on the shelves were thick with dust. The old man tasked with guarding the pavilion lay flat on a rocking chair, snoring thunderously. Yi Chenzhou quietly slipped inside. After searching for half a day among a pile of tattered books used to prop up a table leg, he pulled out a volume whose binding was nearly falling apart and brushed away the thick layer of dust. On the cover were 4 large, crudely written characters, "Crude Sword Techniques." This was a book of physical swordplay intended for mundane martial artists of the mortal realm. Within its pages, there were no instructions on how to circulate spirit chi. It focused entirely on teaching the fundamentals of how to swing and strike with a blade. Even the most useless servant within the sect would look upon this manual with utter disdain. They believed that practicing such a thing would bring shame to a cultivator. But this was exactly what Yi Chenzhou needed. No flashy lights and no requirement to circulate spirit chi. Each strike would be executed in absolute silence, maximizing his ability to remain hidden. He carried the book to the entrance and tapped lightly on the table. The elderly caretaker rubbed his eyes and woke up from his slumber. He glanced at the book in the youth's hand, his expression filled with indifference. He asked why the boy was taking such a piece of trash. He stated that this was inferior even to the lowest grade cultivation manuals. Practicing this for a lifetime would only result in becoming a common mortal street fighter. Yi Chenzhou scratched his head sheepishly and gave a hollow laugh, claiming he simply felt exhausted from his daily chores. He wanted to use the movements in the book to stretch his limbs and strengthen his physical constitution. The old man waved his hand irritably, telling him to take it and leave before turning over to return to his sleep. Yi Chenzhou tucked the crude sword techniques into his robes. Yi Chenzhou headed straight to the woodshed at the labor peak of the back mountain. Today's task was to split 500 caddies of black ironwood. This type of wood was as hard as raw iron. An ordinary servant swinging an axe all day would likely find their palms shattered from the recoil. But Yi Chenzhou was not the least bit flustered. The hardness attribute he had gained on the first day had long since integrated into his skin. He selected a worn, blunt axe from the woodpile. Taking a deep breath, he visualized the first move of the crude sword techniques in his mind, the vertical cleave. There were no flashy or unnecessary movements involved. With his legs slightly bent, he suddenly exerted force from his waist. The power surged through his shoulders to his arms, finally concentrating into the tattered axe. With a crisp crack, the rusted axe struck precisely into the grain of the black ironwood. The rock-hard log was instantly split in two, the cut perfectly smooth. The moment the wood split, his status panel suddenly flashed. The movement had been judged as a perfect match. Crude sword techniques proficiency +1. Yi Chenzhou's eyes instantly widened. He had guessed correctly. His golden finger did not require him to actually wield a sword to train. As long as his force exertion and the trajectory of his movements aligned with the core principles of the sword strikes, his daily labor could be converted into proficiency for his sword arts. He immediately transformed into a veritable god of war among the laborers. Working with the precision of a wound-up machine, he no longer swung his axe with mindless repetition. With every strike, he focused intensely on his breathing, meticulously adjusting his angle and power. A single blow fell, neither wasting a shred of strength nor lacking the necessary force. Throughout the morning, over 300 precise strikes caused his understanding of the chopping motion to skyrocket. An ordinary person delivering hundreds of blows would have been left with exhausted, trembling arms, but with his hardened attribute as a foundation, Yi Chenzhou remained uninjured. Instead, his muscles increasingly adapted to this extreme output of power. At noon, Qian Yufu passed by the woodshed. Seeing Yi Chenzhou drenched in sweat while swinging his axe, he let out a mocking laugh. He remarked that no matter how skilled one became at chopping wood, it would never lead to instant ascension. He suggested it would be better to spend that time sensing spirit chi. Yi Chenzhou paused to wipe his sweat, replying honestly that his aptitude was far too poor. He claimed it was better to chop more wood to ensure his rations weren't docked during the month-end assessment. Qian Yufu spat a curse about mud that cannot plaster a wall before casting a disdainful glance and turning to leave. Yi Chenzhou paid it no mind, tightening his grip on the axe and continuing his work. On his interface, the proficiency level rose once again. That afternoon, Yi Chenzhou appeared at the waste mine pit exactly on time. He gripped the heavy pickaxe, his hands pressed firmly against its rough wooden handle. In his mind, he immediately transitioned to another technique from the basic sword styles, the thrust. With both hands tight on the handle and his legs driving into the earth, his body snapped forward like a fully drawn bow, the pickaxe head turning into a blurred afterimage. It slammed into the rock, sending debris flying in all directions as his proficiency increased by another point. Next came the slash, the sweep, and the strike. Yi Chenzhou deconstructed every mining motion into the forms of a sword technique. Within the depths of the dark mine, he swung his tool relentlessly, strike after strike. While others mined desperately to survive, he labored just as hard to remain inconspicuous. He intentionally slowed his output, ensuring the pickaxe struck only waste rock devoid of spirit stones. By the end of the day, his pile of ore remained strictly at the standard requirement. The overseer cast a contemptuous glance at him, waving him away like a bothersome fly. Thus, the days turned into months. Half a year passed, and the faces on Labor Peak changed wave after wave. Even Chan Yufu met a grim fate. For the sake of a single low-grade spirit stone, his legs. Although he was treated like trash cast out by the sect, Yi Chenzhou continued his daily routine of chopping wood without fail. While mining for ore, he became increasingly inconspicuous, his presence fading to a terrifyingly low level. Even when others stood right beside him, as long as he remained silent, they would fail to sense his existence entirely. For he had refined his breath and movements to their absolute limit. Yet the data on his attribute panel was surging frantically at a staggering speed. His comprehension of swordsmanship had reached an unimaginable height. Now, even with a pair of chopsticks in hand, a casual flick of his wrist perfectly embodied the true essence of the sword. Swift, precise, and lethal, stripped of any redundant motion. 6 months later, deep into the night within a dilapidated, unlit wooden shack, Ye Chenzhou stood before his narrow bed, gripping a discarded iron sword he had scavenged from the mines earlier that day. The blade was chipped in half a dozen places, and its wooden hilt was half-rotten. Expressionless, with eyes as still as a stagnant pool, he slowly raised the rusted iron blade and delivered a light strike into the air. There was no sound of wind, no whistle of tearing air. The strike was so eerily silent it could make one's skin crawl. It was as if the air itself had been cleanly severed by this seemingly ordinary strike. The attribute panel suddenly erupted in a crimson glow, the characters dancing violently across its surface. Basic swordsmanship, having reached its 10,000th breakthrough, has birthed a unique attribute: Extreme Sharpness. The day arrived for the sect's scheduled ration distribution. A long queue had already formed outside the steward's hall. For the labor disciples, 2 pounds of low-grade spirit rice per month was not merely a means of survival but a flicker of hope to advance their cultivation. Yi Chenzhou stood at the very back of the line, with his hands tucked into his sleeves, appearing like a dazed fool who had yet to wake. Steward Zhao Tishan lounged arrogantly in his grand armchair, idly tossing a fragment of a spirit stone in his hand. When Zhou Dezhuang stepped forward to claim his rations and weighed the bag, he grew indignant. It didn't even weigh a single pound. Are the regulations not 2 pounds per month? Zhao Tishan let out a cold sneer and stood up, violently kicking Zhou Dezhuang in the stomach and sending him flying over 2 meters away. Zhou Dezhuang clutched his stomach, writhing on the ground as the rice scattered in every direction. Zhao Tishan approached, grinding the scattered grains of spirit rice beneath his boot. With a crushing presence, he shouted, "My word is the law here. Last month's ore production was insufficient, and the superiors have already deducted my bonus. If I don't take it from you useless trash, how else am I to compensate for the loss? Do you expect me to pay out of my own pocket? Half a caddy of rice, take it or leave it. If you don't like it, get lost." All the labor disciples were paralyzed with fear, not even daring to breathe. Tishan had already reached the 4th level of qi refining. Killing a laborer or two was as simple as crushing ants. No one would even bother to investigate. Ye Chenzhou quickly hurried forward, his face instantly adorned with a highly practiced fawning smile. Zhao Tishan suddenly raised his hand to stop his subordinate from scooping the rice, saying coldly, "I hear Yi Chenzhou has been acting quite shifty lately. Every time he delivers ore, it meets the bare minimum. I wonder if he is intentionally hiding something." This was blatant robbery. The surrounding laborers looked on with eyes full of pity. Yi Chenzhou gave a foolish grin and said, "The manager knows my constitution. Being able to meet the quota is already the absolute limit of my strength." Not only did he refuse that pitiful half caddy of rice, but he also pulled out half a caddy of spirit rice he had painstakingly saved from the previous month. He respectfully pressed the entire cloth bag into Zhao Tishan's hand, saying, "The manager works so hard day and night, burdened with so many worries. I have no desire to eat this rice this month. Please take it to make some porridge to nourish yourself." Zhao Tishan froze momentarily. He weighed the bag of rice and laughed loudly. It seems Yi Chenzhou knows how to show proper respect. Get back to work.
Yes.
Yi Chenzhou cupped his hands and immediately turned to leave the manager's courtyard. A nearby laborer hurriedly caught up and whispered, "Yi Chenzhou, are you mad? You even gave him your savings from last month. What will you eat now?" "Zhao Tishan is far too much. At the very least, we should risk our lives against him." Yi Chenzhou stopped and sighed. "With what will you fight? You are only at the 1st or 2nd level of qi refining. If you want to throw your lives away, go ahead. I still need my life to chop wood." Having said that, he quickened his pace and returned home. Yi Chenzhou knew deep down that if he hadn't offered that rice, Zhao Tishan would have certainly made a move. With his current toughened skin and his extremely sharp sword techniques, defeating Zhao Tishan would be no problem at all. However, following such a defeat, the outer sect enforcement team would arrive to investigate. His cultivation and his attribute panel would both be exposed, to risk being researched by the high-level elders just for a caddy of spirit rice. Only a fool would make such a trade. As long as he remained alive, even if he had to eat tree bark, he could use his attribute panel to refine nutrients. Night fell. Yi Chenzhou gnawed on his black bread, his eyes filled with vigilance. Knowing Zhao Tishan might barge in and attack him whenever his mood soured, Yi Chenzhou knew he had to set a trap within his home. Walking to his bedside, he flipped over a wooden plank, revealing the hard, dry earth beneath. Yi Chenzhou extended his right hand, which had already fused with the hardness attribute. Under the moonlight, his 5 fingers emitted a cold, blue-black metallic sheen. He thrust his hand forcefully into the ground, his fingers sinking deep into the compacted earth. With a surge of strength, he pried a large chunk of hardened soil loose. Not even a single scratch marred his skin. His hands had effectively become powerful digging tools. He began to dig frantically beneath the bed. The excavated soil was placed into buckets to be discarded at the mountain cliff the following morning. No one would be any the wiser. Half an hour later, a vertical pit measuring 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, and 3 meters deep had been formed. Even a mid-stage chi refining cultivator would break their legs falling into this, yet it was still not enough. Leaping out of the pit, Chenzhou selected over 10 of the sturdiest ironwood branches from his woodpile. He pulled out a rusted iron sword from beneath his bed. He then activated his extreme sharpness attribute. With a flick of his wrist and a blur of motion, the hard ironwood branches were instantly carved into dozens of lethal pointed stakes. Next, he retrieved a tattered paper bag from under the bed. Inside was a toxic powder he had refined using his attribute panel from dead rats and poisonous insects over the past few days. A single touch would result in total paralysis of the body. Chenzhou descended into the pit, coating the deadly wooden stakes with the poison and ruthlessly concealing them across the bottom. After emptying the final 2 buckets of soil over the cliffside, Chenzhou was in no hurry to return. He simply brushed the dust from his hands. He walked along the edge of the cliff, following a narrow path overgrown with weeds. He continued deeper into the mountain range. No one traveled this path, for at its entrance stood a moss-covered stone tablet inscribed with 4 jagged characters, the poisonous forbidden zone. Everyone on Laborer's Peak knew that behind this tablet lay a poisonous swamp that had existed for countless years. The place was ominous, shrouded year-round in a sickly green and purple mist. Forget the first-level chi refining laborers. Even the senior brothers and sisters of the late-stage chi refining realm, or even those in the Foundation establishment realm of the inner sect, would not dare enter lightly. It was said that a single breath of the miasma within would corrode one's lungs instantly. There was once an inner sect disciple who recklessly charged. Those who dared venture inside left nothing behind. Not even a complete skeleton remained, only a few charred, blackened bones scattered along the edge of the swamp. Since then, this place became a restricted zone within the sect, a forbidden land that everyone avoided at all costs. However, as Chenzhou gazed at the thick, swirling mist ahead, his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Others feared the poison, but what he lacked most was precisely this kind of untapped attribute source that no one dared to claim. Chenzhou was not so foolish to rely solely on his physical body to withstand the toxins. He turned and hurried back to his wooden hut, retrieving half a bowl of charcoal from the stove. He ground it into a fine powder with a stone and tore the thickest piece of fabric from his bedsheets. After soaking the cloth in water, he tightly wrapped the damp charcoal powder within it. Finally, he found a hollow bamboo tube and inserted it to serve as a breathing pipe. A crude self-made gas mask was complete, simple in design, yet absolute in its effectiveness. Half an hour later, Chenzhou stood once again before the stone tablet. He pressed the cloth against his face, securing it tightly behind his head. Clenching the bamboo tube between his teeth, he took a deep breath. The air filtered through the damp cloth and charcoal before entering his lungs. It carried a faint scent of smoke and earth. Nevertheless, it successfully filtered out the majority of the lethal miasma. Without a moment's hesitation, he plunged into the swirling clouds of violet-blue poison. As he crossed the outer perimeter, his exposed neck and arms were immediately enveloped. He felt an immediate stinging sensation. It was as if countless ants were tearing at his flesh. His skin, which had already fused with toughening attributes, began to break out in abnormal red welts. The toxic gas fought to invade his pores, but far from being distressed, Chenzhou was elated. He immediately commanded his system to begin absorption. The attribute panel flickered with a cold blue light. Low-level mixed miasma detected. Absorption successful. Poison resistance. He chose to fuse the attribute into his skin and blood. The stinging sensation instantly subsided. With a faint smirk, he bit down on the bamboo tube and ventured deeper. The further he went, the denser the fog became, and the surrounding trees grew withered and blackened. Viscous green liquid dripped from the barren branches, while the ground was littered with the bleached bones of unknown beasts. Notifications flashed across the attribute panel incessantly. Poison resistance +1+1+2. Chenzhou moved like an inexhaustible vacuum, frantically absorbing the toxins from the air as he walked. An hour passed, and as he completed a circuit around its edge, the stinging sensation vanished entirely. Now the miasma at the perimeter felt like nothing more than a light breeze against his skin, leaving not even a trace of redness. His poison resistance attribute had skyrocketed to fit 500 points. The toxic gas at the outer rim was nearly depleted, and the rate of attribute gain had slowed significantly. Chenzhou turned his gaze toward the swamp's depths, where trees no longer grew, only pits of bubbling black sludge remained. He stepped cautiously onto a piece of rotting wood. He approached a sludge pit the size of a basin. It bubbled and churned, emitting a sour, putrid stench that was nauseating to the core. A stray gray-furred rat scurried past, but its foot slipped, sending it tumbling into the mire. It only had time for a single shrill cry of agony. Within seconds, its flesh and bone dissolved into a pool of black liquid. Not a single fragment remained. The sight sent a chill down Chenzhou's spine, yet far from retreating, his heart began to race with excitement. If I absorb this and use it as an attack, what would Zhao Tishan in his 4th-level chi refining stage even amount to? A single slap could turn him to ash. Not daring to touch it directly, Chenzhou picked up a dry branch and gently dipped it into the surface of the mud pit. The moment the branch touched the mud, the tip sizzled and began to corrode, releasing a plume of white smoke. Yi Chenzhou immediately commanded the system to absorb it. His attribute panel appeared, detecting high-intensity corrosive matter. Absorption successful. Having gained 1 point of corrosion, he chose to fuse it into the bones and skin of his 10 fingers. A slight sensation of numbness washed over his fingertips. Discarding the half-dissolved branch, he hovered his hands directly over the mud and began to absorb the energy frantically. Corrosion +1 +5 +10. The black liquid within the pit became transparent at a visible rate, and the pungent, sour stench dissipated along with it. Once the pit was fully drained and turned into ordinary water, Ye Chenzhou's corrosive attribute had accumulated to 2,000 points. Ye Chenzhou stood up and examined his hands. His 10 fingers radiated a strange purple-green light. He reached toward a fist-sized rock nearby and touched it lightly. The surface of the rock immediately emitted white smoke and began to melt. Seconds later, it had transformed into a bubbling puddle of gray liquid. Suddenly, the tolling of a bronze bell echoed from the direction of the main peak. As the sound persisted, the entirety of Laborer Peak began to stir with excitement. Today was the sect's triennial Outer Sect Grand Assembly. This was the only day the laborers could openly neglect their duties to witness the spectacle at the front mountain. The laborers, who were usually oppressed like beasts of burden by the supervisors, all flocked toward the front mountain. Yi Chenzhou, hurry up. If we are late, there won't even be a place to stand. An intersect elder known as the Cold-Face Rakshasa is personally overseeing the battles, and even senior sister Shenqing Chang will take the stage. I must have eaten some moldy black bread last night. My stomach is in knots right now. Zhou Dazhuang cursed and ran off like a streak of fire. Soon, Laborer Peak was completely deserted. The pained expression on Yi Chenzhou's face vanished instantly. What was the point of watching a group of mid to late stage qi refining cultivators fight? If a hot-tempered senior brother lost his focus, a stray strand of sword qi could easily fly into the crowd. Lowly laborers like them would lose their lives in an instant. Seeking excitement in such a place is truly a way to court death. Yi Chenzhou turned around and headed straight for the firewood warehouse behind the Laborer Peak. The interior was deserted, save for a half-bald deacon dozing off at his desk. Everyone else had gone to the Grand Assembly. Yi Chenzhou stepped forward and lightly tapped on the table. I am here to claim today's task. Today is the Outer Sect Grand Assembly, and the entire sect has a half-day holiday. What kind of task are you running here to claim? My aptitude is poor and my cultivation is low. If I do not work hard, next month's spirit rice allowance will be docked once again. Taking advantage of the fact that no one is around today, I will head to the scrap warehouse to clear out the junk and remove the completely useless shards to create some space. He would report back once the finished, but that was merely a facade for his true objective. The scrap warehouse, located in the darkest corner of Bitter Peak, was a massive stone cavern that remained untouched by sunlight year-round. With thousands of sect disciples engaged in daily battles, duels, and expeditions, countless artifacts were damaged beyond repair. These completely broken remnants were cast aside here like mere refuse. As the heavy stone door was pushed open, a pungent scent of rust and mildew rushed forth. Inside the cavern, broken sabers, shattered spears, and fractured armor were piled high, forming mountains of scrap metal. To others, this was a worthless junkyard, but in Ye Chenzhou's eyes, it was an unguarded supreme gold mine. Yi Chenzhou stepped inside and firmly shut the warehouse door. Still feeling it was not secure enough, he hauled a discarded medicinal cauldron weighing several hundred pounds and used it to block the entrance directly. After confirming that it was absolutely impossible for anyone to enter from the outside, he unsheathed that rusted iron sword from his waist. He approached the pile of debris nearest to the door and casually picked up the broken half of a mountain-cleaving saber. His attribute panel appeared. Damaged first-grade low-rank artifact detected. Absorption successful. Having gained 1 point of sharpness, Ye Chenzhou immediately ordered it to be fused into the iron sword in his hand. The broken saber instantly disintegrated into a pile of gray-white iron powder, slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, the rusted iron sword in his other hand began to vibrate softly. Without pausing, he plunged both hands into the scrap pile, beginning a frantic and unrestrained sweep. The notifications on his attribute panel began to stream together in a continuous flow. Sharpness 3, durability +2. Sharpness +1, durability 5. Wherever his hands passed, hundreds, then thousands of artifacts shattered. Like brittle fossils weathered by millennia, they crumbled into fine powder one after another. Like a machine, Ye Chenzhou frantically absorbed sharpness and durability from these thousands of broken artifacts. 1 hour passed, then 2. The scrap piles visibly diminished as a thick layer of iron ash and impurities accumulated on the ground. When he finally reduced the last cracked black iron shield in the corner to powder, he finally came to a halt, exhaling a long breath drenched in sweat. Yet he had drained the final remnants of value from thousands of shattered magical artifacts. The two attributes of sharpness and durability had surged to a staggering 30,000 points. Yi Chenzhou looked down at the rusted iron sword in his right hand. Upon its blade, a faint dark streak appeared, seemingly capable of severing light itself. The sharpness of this broken sword now far exceeded its original quality. With a gentle swing, a faint whistle resonated through the air. Today, the outer sect's firewood storage was nearly turned upside down. A single mission offering a mere 10 low-grade spirit stones had incited a brawl among dozens of disciples. Wood splinters flew in every direction as a mouthful of blood sprayed across the ground. 2 outer sect disciples drew their swords with bloodshot eyes, all for a mission to tend fish at the cold pond. That mission did not just offer 10 spirit stones, it also allowed one to absorb the dense spiritual chi of the cold pond for half a month, free of charge. It was truly a lucrative opportunity. One disciple pointed at the other and roared, "I claimed this mission first. There is no name on it, whoever seizes it owns it." As their insults grew more heated, they clashed with swords, immediately drawing a crowd of onlookers eager for a spectacle. The cold pond was a fine place, though it was a bit chilly. Chenzhou kept a low profile, hunching his shoulders like an invisible man as he hugged the wall, slipping into the deepest corner of the firewood shed. He did not even spare a glance at the two outer sect disciples, who were now battered and bloodied from their fight. 10 spirit stones might sound like a lot, but they were not worth risking one's life. Should one end up crippled, the cost of medicine would far exceed those 10 stones. He approached the most neglected mission board. The wooden plaques were covered in a thick layer of dust, listing nothing but grueling manual labor that offered no spirit stones. His gaze swept past tasks like hauling manure, washing dishes, and tending to spirit beasts before finally settling on a pitch-black wooden plaque, repairing the stone steps of the back mountain. The reward was a mere 3 sect contribution points with no meals provided. It was a job even a dog would refuse. The ancient stone path on the back mountain stretched for 10,000 steps. Neglected for years, it was composed of massive bluestone slabs. Not only was the work backbreaking, but it also offered absolutely no benefits. Yet Chenzhou looked at it as if he had discovered a peerless cultivation manual. He snatched the wooden plaque and ran to the counter, declaring, "I accept this task." The dozing deacon looked up and spared him a glance. "Half of those steps have already collapsed. If you do not finish within 3 days, 10 contribution points will be deducted. I am certain. My cultivation is low, and I prefer the quiet. I would rather do some honest labor." He pressed his thumbprint, took the tool voucher, and turned to leave immediately, fearing the deacon might change his mind. Half an hour later, Chenzhou stood at the foot of the back mountain. This place was truly desolate, not a single soul was in sight. The stone steps were overgrown with green moss and jaggedly broken, stretching far into the mist halfway up the mountain. He cast aside his pickaxe and mortar, paying no heed to the shattered stone slabs. Taking a deep breath, he braced his legs in a wide stance. His hands pressed firmly against a massive exposed stone vein beside him. This was the earth vein of the rear mountain, a culmination of tens of thousands of years of geological settling. What it possessed in abundance was an unshakable foundational power. His attribute panel manifested, detecting the dense heaviness attribute within the massive earth vein. Successive absorptions completed. Gaining 1 point of heaviness, Chenzhou commanded without hesitation to fuse it entirely into his bones and musculature. In an instant, his legs felt leaden, as if hundreds of pounds of molten lead had been poured into them. Yet as he moved, he found his body remained light. His mobility was entirely unhindered. That dense power was internal. It did not reduce his speed, but instead rendered his lower foundation as immovable as an ancient tree rooted in solid rock. Steady as Mount Tai, Chenzhou began his labor. With one hand, he hoisted shattered slabs weighing hundreds of pounds, tossing them aside as effortlessly as if they were soft tofu. His other hand remained in constant contact with the earth or the cliff face, maintaining a continuous state of absorption. Heaviness +5, 10, +20. Notifications on his attribute panel refreshed frantically as he handled massive slabs that would normally require the strength of 5 men to lift. He gripped one end with a single hand, and with a well-placed kick, slotted the stone precisely into the gaps of the stairway. Yet he paid no mind to the speed of his repairs. His entire focus was fixed on his attribute points, which were surging at a maddening pace. 1 day passed, then 2. When hunger struck, Chenzhou gnawed on the hard, dry rations he had brought along. When thirsty, he drank from the mountain springs. When exhausted, he slept briefly upon the cold stone steps. The power within the rear mountain's earth vein was truly boundless. This sensation of continuously absorbing free attributes left him utterly enthralled, unable to stop. Deep within his bones, faint crackling sounds began to echo. Beneath his skin, which had already fused with hardness attributes, a faint dark golden radiance began to emanate. His physical density was skyrocketing at a truly terrifying rate. On the evening of the 3rd day, as twilight descended, Chenzhou kicked the final stone slab into place. It was a perfect fit. He stood tall, exhaling a long breath that carried the scent of the earth. The path of 10,000 broken steps had been restored to a smooth finish by his hands alone. Yet, what truly fueled his excitement was the data on his attribute panel. His heaviness attribute had reached exactly 10,000 points. Chenzhou clenched his fists, feeling as though he were a humanoid mountain compressed to the absolute limit. He looked down at the bluestone slab beneath his feet, curious to see how the 10,000 points of the heavy attribute concentrated within his body would manifest. He attempted a light leap, causing the ground of the entire mountain behind him to tremble violently. A dull rumble echoed through the air, sending the birds in the surrounding forest fleeing in a panicked frenzy. Chenzhou hastily withdrew his strength, suppressing those 10,000 points of the heavy attribute deep into his bone marrow. Had anyone witnessed that leap, they would have surely mistaken him for some strange creature and captured him for dissection and study. He quickly retrieved his broom, pretending as if nothing had happened. He strolled toward another secluded forest path in the rear mountain to begin his daily sweeping duties. The commotion from earlier had been a bit too significant. He needed to occupy himself with mundane chores to mask his presence from others. Before half an hour of sweeping had passed, a heavy, ragged panting suddenly drifted from the thickets beside the narrow path. This was followed by the sharp sound of snapping branches. Chenzhou's ears twitched, and he immediately halted his broom. A figure soaked in blood staggered out from the bushes and collapsed onto the very bluestone slab that Chenzhou had just swept clean. The blood stained a large portion of the ground a deep crimson. Chenzhou focused his gaze. The man wore distinctive moon-white robes, the signature attire of an inner sect disciple. However, those robes were now reduced to mere tatters. A deep blade wound gashed across his chest. His left arm had been completely severed from the shoulder. An eerie black miasma billowed from the wound. To still be alive after such grievous injuries, his fortune was truly formidable. The inner sect disciple struggled to raise his head. His face was caked in grime, and his tear-filled eyes locked onto Chenzhou, who stood there holding his broom. Trembling, he pulled a jade slip stained with dark blood and a storage ring from his chest. In a raspy, strained voice, he spoke. "Quickly, take these to the front mountain. Find Elder Fang of the Array Hall. Tell him there is a traitor. If you deliver this message, the spirit stones and medicinal pills within this ring shall be yours. Elder Fang will even guarantee your entry into the inner sect. There you will find true fortune." Chenzhou stood motionless without even a blink. As he looked at the shimmering storage ring, his heart remained entirely undisturbed. Had it been some naive newcomer, they would surely be trembling with excitement, seizing the ring to go play the hero. An inner sect disciple with a cultivation level of at least the late-stage chi refining realm had been mutilated in such a manner. Just how ruthless must his pursuer be? They were likely at the Foundation establishment realm, or perhaps even higher, to become entangled in a power struggle within the inner sect's high-ranking members, or perhaps a murderous vendetta. Indeed, one's life is valuable, yet that jade slip is nothing more than a death warrant. That storage ring likely bears a spiritual sense mark or some other tracking technique. Whoever takes it dies. Inner disciples of these great sects often leave a life soul lamp within their sect. Once they are killed, the final image seen before death or the killer's aura is highly likely to be transmitted back to the soul lamp. To court disaster over mere scraps and trifles, it is truly the height of folly. Chenzhou remained silent, his breathing not wavering for even a second. He did not step forward to save the man or forge a connection, nor did he fish in troubled waters. Instead, he took a step back, tightening his grip on the broom. Watching Chenzhou retreat, the inner disciple spat out a mouthful of black blood in rage, his voice hoarse as he roared, "Take it, quickly!" Chenzhou ignored him completely, turning away without the slightest hesitation. With professional composure, he began to sweep. He swung his broom, following the path he had just taken, sweeping away the layers of fallen leaves and dust, precisely erasing the footprints where he had stood. The sound of the broom against the earth felt eerily out of place in this gloomy forest. The inner disciple began to curse in desperation. Bastard. His voice grew increasingly faint. Chenzhou acted as if he heard nothing. Let him curse, words alone could not draw blood. He retreated toward a dense thicket, swiftly clearing all traces as he moved. Even a single broken blade of grass was brushed back into its original position, leaving no evidence of his presence. He retreated 10 meters. Chenzhou crouched low and slipped into a patch of waist-high weeds. Releasing a fraction of his 10,000 heavy attribute points, he suppressed his heartbeat and slowed his blood circulation. Crouching in the mud, he withdrew his aura until he was as cold and still as a stone. Silence. Chenzhou had not been hidden for more than a few breaths when 3 shadowy figures descended from the sky like vengeful spirits, landing beside the fallen inner disciple. A thick, suffocating killing intent immediately enveloped the area. The ambient temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The pursuers, men clad in black, arrived at the scene and surveyed their surroundings. They completely failed to notice Chenzhou sitting motionless in the grass just 10 meters away. The 3 men in black searched the area for a long time. Aside from the inner court disciple's corpse and leaves stained with black blood, they found nothing. Why is the item not on his person? Could a passing spirit beast have dragged it away? Nonce. Dispose of the body and retreat immediately. The disciples of the Array Hall will catch the scent and arrive soon. The men in black quickly sprinkled corpse-dissolving powder onto the remains. Following a plume of pungent yellow smoke, the corpse dissolved into a pool of black liquid. With a flash of movement, the 3 figures vanished into the depths of the forest. Chenzhou remained crouched in the weeds 10 meters away. He did not move. He was in no hurry to reveal himself. Instead, he remained hidden in the brush for another full hour. Only when complete darkness fell and the silence of the back mountain was absolute did he slowly stand and brush the dust from his robes. He sighed to himself, those inner court disciples are truly ruthless. Gripping his broom, he hurried along a deserted path back to his dilapidated wooden hut, bolting the door and bracing it with a chair. The day's event served as a dire warning. The sect was becoming increasingly perilous. Even inner court disciples now dared to commit blatant murder on the back mountain to silence witnesses. Should these ruthless individuals ever make their way to Bitter Peak, his crumbling hut would not withstand even a single strand of their sword chi. The 3-meter-deep poison trap beneath the floor was meant for ambushes, but it required an intruder to actually step inside first. If they simply chose to set the hut ablaze or level it with a spell from the outside, he would be buried alive along with his own trap. I must reinforce this house. I must layer its defenses until they are impenetrable. Chenzhou immediately set to work. He pulled several broken jars from beneath his bed. They were filled with gray-white metallic powder, residue from his obsessive extraction of essence from broken spiritual tools. Though these fragments had lost their sharpness and flexibility, the materials themselves consisted of refined iron and profound copper. and even some ores of a much higher grade. As materials for inscribing formations, nothing could be more suitable. He found a cracked bowl, filled it halfway with water, added the metallic powder, and then bit his finger. He added a few drops of blood as a catalyst and stirred the mixture frantically with a chopstick. Soon a bowl of specially prepared formation ink, as thick and dark as black mud, was ready. Yi Chenzhou knew no profound formations. The tattered manual provided by Bitter Peak contained only two mediocre diagrams. One was the solidifying wall formation, typically used to keep rats out of rice jars. The other was the key masking formation, often employed to deodorize latrines. Normally, no one would spare a second glance at such low-level formations as their power was pitiably weak, yet Yi Chenzhou did not care. If quality was lacking, he would compensate with sheer quantity. He crouched down, dipping a chopstick into the bowl of black mud ink, and began to painstakingly trace the patterns of the solidifying wall formation onto the underside of the floorboards. This formation diagram was incredibly simple, consisting of nothing more than several interlocking circles and 12 radiating lines. Even the dullest of the labor disciples could easily replicate it. Yet after finishing the first, Yi Chenzhou did not stop. He drew a second right beside the first, then a third, and then a fourth. He flipped the entire floorboard over, densely covering the back with formations until he had completed 50 in total. 50 of the lowest-tier solidifying wall formations were now stacked upon a single wooden plank. A single solidifying wall formation possessed defensive power equivalent to a thin layer of iron. Thus, 50 layers stacked together were equivalent to 50 layers of iron plating welded firmly onto the wood. After finishing the floor, he began his work on the walls. He dismantled the wooden planks from all four walls one by one. After covering their backs with solidifying wall formations, he reinstalled them. From the outside, this dilapidated wooden shack still looked like a ruin that could collapse at any moment. But from within, the back of every single plank was densely packed with formation arrays. The black lines reflected a faint ethereal light within the darkness. Next, he began drawing chi masking formations on the backs of the door and the window frames. It was the same process, the same relentless, almost obsessive dedication. Every single spot was reinforced with 50 stacked chi masking formations. Once finished, the entire shack seemed to be draped in an invisible cloak. Even if one were to pass by outside, they would be unable to sense even the breath of someone within. As Yi Chenzhou drew the final stroke, he straightened his back and surveyed the room. Gazing upon his masterpiece, he nodded with satisfaction. From the outside, the hut remained the most dilapidated and unremarkable shack on Kui Peak. A single gust of wind would make it creak, and the gaps in the door were wide enough to fit a hand through. In reality, however, the defensive strength of this house could now rival that of a small fortress. With 50 layers of solidifying wall formations on the walls, even a kick from a late-stage chi-refining cultivator would result in nothing but sparks. With a 3-meter-deep trap beneath the floor, any intruder would find it a journey with no return. 50 layers of chi-masking formation swallowed every trace of energy from within. Yi Chenzhou returned the wooden board to its place on. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary, dilapidated wooden bed. No one could have suspected that beneath those planks lay a lethal pit 3 meters deep. The bottom of the pit was lined with sharp, poison-tipped spikes. He lay upon the bed and closed his eyes, a faint smirk playing across the corner of his lips. In this predatory world of cultivation, to survive, one must be armed to the teeth. On the surface, he was an invisible nobody, the most unremarkable person on the first Bitter Peak. Yet, in the shadows, his small wooden hut had been transformed into an impregnable fortress. As long as he remained low profile and revealed nothing, his attribute panel would continue to bolster his foundation without end, until his attributes reached a level where even those in the golden core stage could do him no harm. Only then would he truly reveal his hidden fangs. Until that day, he, Yi Chenzhou, would remain the most unassuming, talentless, and invisible salted fish on the first Bitter Peak. No one could force him to show his hand, and no one could compel him to take a risk. He rolled over, pulling his blanket tight. Under the layered protection of 50 solid wall formations and chi-concealing formations, he drifted into sleep. The moonlight filtered through the gaps in the door, illuminating his peaceful countenance. The night on the first Bitter Peak remained as silent as ever. No one knew that within this dilapidated wooden hut, a monster was silently growing in power. Nor did anyone realize that the frail servant who spent his days sweeping and chopping wood was already imbued with terrifying attributes, enough to crush those at the peak of the chi-refining stage. Yet all of this was merely the beginning. Solid wall formations within concealing formations, grand arrays within minor ones, all interconnected. As an hour passed, 10 layers of formations were inscribed upon the walls, and the musty scent of the hut vanished completely. Even the sound of his breathing would not escape these walls. From the outside, not a single sound could be heard. But even this was not enough. Yi Chenzhou held his broken bowl, continuing to dip his brush into the ink to draw 20 more layers. 30 layers, then 40, beads of sweat rolled down his chin. His wrist throbbed with exhaustion, yet his gaze grew increasingly fervent. The droplets of specially crafted metallic ink were drawn deep into the grain of the wooden planks by the formation's power. The ordinary rotting wood was undergoing a bizarre and profound transformation. It was not until the break of dawn that he finally completed the final stroke. 50 full layers of solid wall and chi-concealing formations now stood intertwined, sealing his meager 10-square-meter hut. Yi Chenzhou cast aside his worn-out brush and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. He looked around him. From the outside, the wooden hut still looked dilapidated, as if it would collapse with a single gust of wind. Not even a trace of a formation could be seen on the walls. The breath-concealing formation had perfectly masked all spiritual energy fluctuations. Chenzhou stood up and walked toward the wall opposite the main entrance. Taking a deep breath, he immediately channeled the heaviness attribute in his legs and the sturdiness attribute in his arms. He had already fused 10,000 points of heaviness and several thousand points of sturdiness. With this single punch, even the 1,000-pound bluestones of the rear mountain would be reduced to rubble. Suddenly twisting his waist, his right fist lunged forward with a piercing whistle of wind. He struck violently at the wooden wall of the seemingly unstable hut. Yet as his full force strike landed, not even a single splinter broke off from the wooden planks. Chenzhou rubbed his slightly numb right knuckles, looking with satisfaction at the wooden wall. Not even the paint had peeled after 50 layers of formations were applied. The durability of this dilapidated wooden hut now likely surpassed the defensive treasures of an inner sect elder. He now had a safe house, yet he remained uneasy. No matter how sturdy the house was, he could not hide inside forever. If he were to encounter high-level cultivators battling outside, a stray wisp of sword chi or a collateral blast could easily end him. Although his body was tough, it was far from invincible. He needed to find some life-saving items, preferably something wearable. He felt his thin coin purse. Through years of frugality and saving every possible scrap, he had managed to accumulate about a dozen spirit stone fragments. This meager amount at the sect's official pavilion of 1,000 treasures would not even suffice to purchase the hilt of the lowest-grade spiritual tool. His only option was to head to the black market outside and test his luck. The Tianquan sect's market was established in a vast valley on the border between the front and rear mountains. Chenzhou changed into his most tattered servant robes, ruffled his hair, and lowered his head, blending into the bustling crowd entering the market. Elegant shops lined both sides of the street, with beautiful female cultivators standing at the entrances to invite customers. Without even lifting an eyelid, he walked straight past the main road and slipped into the deepest, filthiest alley where second-hand goods were sold. Here tattered cloths were haphazardly spread out on either side, covered in all sorts of miscellaneous items. There were broken swords, blackened medicinal herbs of unknown names, and even demonic beast bones still caked in mud. Most of the sellers were disgruntled outer sect thugs or low-level disciples desperate for coin. The air was filled with the sounds of shouting vendors. Some peddled damaged artifacts supposedly unearthed from ancient cultivators' caves, asking for only 50 low-grade spirit stones. Others shouted about the fangs of second-rank demonic beasts, claiming them to be top-tier materials for weapon refinement. Chenzhou walked with his arms crossed, moving like a wanderer through the stalls. He didn't even bother to inquire about the shiny, eye-catching items that were selling fast. Such things had already been scanned countless times by the divine sense of others. If there were any true treasures, they would never be left for him to find. Furthermore, the prices were far too steep. He could not afford them, and such a purchase would easily draw unwanted attention. He focused his search on stalls selling scrap stone and discarded iron. These were stalls tucked away in secluded corners, where even the vendors could not identify the items they were selling. After wandering for half an hour, Chenzhou stopped before a tattered mat in a remote corner. The vendor was an elderly outer sect disciple, thin as a monkey, dozing off against the wall. Spread across the mat were several pieces of rusted iron, a few ruined talismans, and various other worthless trinkets. Chenzhou squatted down, casually rummaging through the iron slag, then feigned indifference as he glanced at a black stone sitting on the corner of the mat, used as a weight. It was merely the size of a fist and pitch black, with a jagged surface and no spiritual aura whatsoever, looking exactly like coal slag from a forging furnace. However, as he approached, the attribute extraction panel in his mind gave a rare, subtle fluctuation. This indicated that this piece of slag contained something significant enough to be recognized by the system. Chenzhou picked up a piece of iron slag and asked the price with a deliberate frown. The monkey-like vendor glanced at his handyman robes and lazily quoted a price of 5 spirit stones. Chenzhou tossed the iron back onto the mat in disdain, turning as if to leave. The vendor hurriedly sat upright. 3 stones. Chenzhou stopped and sighed. Fine, 3 it is, but I have a habit. I like a small bonus whenever I buy something. With those words, he reached out with natural ease, grabbing the black stone that was weighing down the corner of the mat. He tossed it up and down twice. It felt heavy and ice-cold to the touch. This worthless stone you use as a weight is mine now. It will serve well enough to prop up my broken bed leg. He quickly counted out 3 spirit stone fragments, pressed them into the vendor's hand, took the items, and disappeared into the crowd. The vendor stared blankly at the stones in his palm, then looked toward the direction where Chenzhou had vanished and let out a disdainful sneer. Where did this fool come from? Treating a piece of common iron slag like a treasure, and even taking that scrap stone. Half an hour later, Chenzhou had returned to his wooden cabin, now as secure as a fortress. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat cross-legged on his bed. Tossing the iron slag aside, he lifted the black stone with both hands. Taking a deep breath, he commanded the extraction process in his mind. The interface instantly erupted with a brilliant green light, more dazzling than any time before. High-purity ancient rune fragments. A dense web of cracks suddenly spider-webbed across the surface of the black stone. Layers of the black outer shell peeled away like dried mud, crumbling into a fine powder that slipped through his fingers. In less than 3 breaths, the once fist-sized stone had vanished, leaving behind only a faintly glowing object no larger than a fingernail. This was no mere attribute but a blood-red rune of immense complexity, resembling a miniature formation interwoven within itself. It hovered half an inch above his palm, radiating a violent aura that instilled a primal sense of dread. The system interface flashed with success. He had obtained a special rare keyword, the counter damage rune. Its effect: upon receiving a physical or magical attack, it would instantly reflect 100% of the absorbed damage back to the assailant. Yi Chenzhou drew in a sharp breath of cold air. His eyes widened in shock. Reflecting total damage meant that as long as an opponent could not kill him with a single blow, even if a Foundation Establishment cultivator were to strike him with a blade, that same attacker would be forced to endure a strike of equal magnitude. Combined with his tortoise-shell physique, boasting 10,000 points of mass and thousands in durability, anyone foolish enough to attack him would meet a miserable end. The interface prompted him to select a target for fusion. With one hand, Ye Chenzhou tore away his tattered outer robes, revealing a coarse beast-hide vest underneath, faded and worn thin from constant washing. It was covered in patches from top to bottom. This was a second-hand item he had bartered for with a dozen spirit stones when he first joined the sect. Without a moment's hesitation, he fused the counter-damage rune into the form-fitting inner armor. The surface of the vest pulsed with an eerie crimson glow. Moments later, the light faded and it returned to its deceptively pathetic and tattered appearance. Early the next morning, as was his custom, Ye Chenzhou carried 2 large wooden buckets toward the spirit fields. The sun was scorching and the air stiflingly still. A group of laboring disciples were hunched over, weeding the soil and clearing pests. In the adjacent field, Chu Dezhuang wiped away sweat while quietly cursing Steward Zhao Tiashan for once again skimming off their supply of spirit insect repellent. At that moment, a low, resonating horn blast echoed from the depths of the rear mountain. The horn's cry was desolate and sharp, possessing a piercing power that was vastly different from the usual copper bell used to summon disciples. The wooden ladle in Yi Chenzhou's hand froze mid-motion. He looked up just as the ground began to tremble, a slight vibration at first. Ripples formed across the water in his buckets, but within a few breaths, the tremors intensified violently, as if thousands of war horses were charging in a frantic gallop. Chu Dezhuang straightened his back, staring blankly toward the rear mountain. Wondering aloud if an earth dragon was turning in its slumber, a sharp-eyed laborer suddenly cried out, pointing toward the wooden palisade on the outskirts of Kuyi Peak. The defensive wall, twice the height of a man and constructed from thick ironwood, was instantly shredded as if it were mere paper. Amidst a storm of flying splinters, dozens of demonic beasts, each the size of a young bull, erupted into view. Their eyes glowed a murderous crimson, and they brought with them a foul, stench-ridden gale. They charged directly into the servant quarter. Those were the spirit beasts from the beast-taming peak of the back mountain. They had gone mad. A spirit beast riot had broken out, and the entire spirit field instantly fell into chaos. These low-level spirit beasts, typically used for pulling carriages or guarding the sect gates, had now completely lost their sanity. Leading the charge were several steel-toothed boars, their bodies covered in coarse black bristles. Their tusks were longer than daggers. They lowered their heads, goring anyone in their path. An elderly servant who was too slow to flee couldn't even let out a scream. He was struck directly in the waist by the powerful charge of a steel-toothed boar. The servants were in a state of total collapse. Their highest cultivation level did not exceed the second stage of qi refining. They did not possess even a single decent offensive spell. The only weapons in their hands were hoes and sickles. Facing these frenzied demonic beasts, it was nothing short of a one-sided slaughter. The scene instantly dissolved into absolute turmoil. Some fled toward the mountain, others hid in their houses, while some were so paralyzed by fear that they collapsed onto the ground. Yi Chenzhou stood his ground, his brow furrowed. He did not run. In such a chaotic situation, turning one's back on 4-legged beasts was tantamount to offering one's head. 2 legs could never outrun 4. However, he absolutely could not reveal his strength. To him, these low-level beasts were as fragile as paper. A single punch could shatter a steel-toothed boar's skull. But what would happen after that? A riot of the sect's spirit beasts was no small matter. It was possible that an inner-sect elder was hovering in the sky on a flying sword, scanning the area with divine sense. He was a lowly servant at the first stage of qi refining. For him to kill a rank 1 beast with a single strike, if the upper echelons witnessed this, he would be strapped to a dissection table by tomorrow. He could neither fight nor flee. Yi Chenzhou's gaze quickly swept across the surroundings. Not far away, several gale wolves had just pounced on the fleeing servants. They were savagely tearing at them, and 4 or 5 servants already lay there unconscious. Yi Chenzhou took a deep breath and charged toward them without a moment's hesitation. He wasn't going to save them, he was going to use the scene to his advantage. Arriving beside a fallen servant, he stepped into a puddle of dark mud and reached down to smear a streak of dark blood from the ground. He rubbed it haphazardly across his face and neck. With both hands, he forcefully tore the fabric of his chest and sleeves into tatters. He disguised himself with what appeared to be jagged lacerations. His movements were seamless, as fluid as drifting clouds in flowing water. His camouflage complete, Ye Chenzhou threw himself to the earth, feigning death amongst the heap of unmoving bodies. With meticulous care, he draped a tattered scrap of clothing across his back to further the illusion. Half his face was buried in the mire, leaving only a single nostril clear to draw breath. Simultaneously, he channeled the 10,000 attribute points of heavy shoes within his body. He forcibly slowed his heartbeat and the circulation of his blood. His breathing grew shallow, becoming nearly imperceptible. His body temperature plummeted rapidly. At this moment, even if someone were to check his pulse, they would conclude he was nothing more than a fresh corpse. Agonizing screams echoed relentlessly around him, accompanied by the sickening sounds of tearing flesh and beasts gnashing on bone. Kui Peak had been utterly transformed into a Shura field. The thick scent of blood drove the demonic beasts into an even greater frenzy. Like an unstoppable tide, they trampled over stone and earth, obliterating wooden huts and spirit fields alike. Yi Chenzhou kept his eyes shut, his heart as cold and still as a frozen lake. If he could only survive this wave until the formation masters and intersect experts arrived, these low-level beasts would be swiftly suppressed. All he had to do was remain silent and play his role as a background corpse to perfection. Suddenly, a heavy, ragged, and foul breath sounded right beside Yi Chenzhou's ear. The earth vibrated with the weight of heavy footsteps. Along with the footsteps, a massive demonic beast lumbered toward the pile of bodies. Its heavy paws squelched through the blood-soaked mud. He felt a drenched tongue, covered in serrated barbs, lick the corpse beside him twice, as if discerning which piece of flesh was the freshest. The beast then moved closer to the area where Yi Chenzhou lay. It began to sniff, exhaling a gust of hot, humid, and rancid breath directly onto the nape of his neck. This was a mid-grade, first-rank black-armored bear. Its massive frame dwarfed a mature forest buffalo, and its fur stood rigid like needles of steel. This species possessed not only peerless strength, but also a hide as thick as armor. Once enraged, even an ordinary late-stage chi refinement cultivator would not dare face it head-on. Yet Yi Chenzhou remained as still as a boulder, his eyelids never even flinching. The black, armored bear let out a low, guttural growl from deep within its throat. It raised its right paw, a limb larger than a wash basin. Caked in filth and mud, the beast brought its heavy palm crashing down with savage intent. This single strike carried a force of at least 1,000 caddies. Against an ordinary handyman, such a blow would instantly shatter the... Yet in the mere millisecond that the bear's claw made contact with Yi Chenzhou's back, the tattered beast-hide armor clinging to his flesh, which had previously shown no sign of power, suddenly erupted with a flash of crimson runic light. A hidden interface manifested, revealing deep-seated bloodline secrets. External physical attack detected. Damage reflection rune activated. With 100% damage reflection, coupled with Yi Chenzhou's 10,000 points of density and thousands of points of fortitude within his body, his entire being was now akin to a heavy greave welded into the earth, its hardness rivaling that of 10,000-year profound iron. The black-armored bear's full-strength strike slammed into this immovable defense. Every ounce of the kinetic force was perfectly absorbed by the runes in an instant, only to be violently unleashed back upon the attacker. A bone-chilling crunch of shattering skeleton erupted, drowning out the cacophony of the surrounding battlefield. Before the black-armored bear could even let out a cry, its massive right limb from claw to shoulder seemed to ignite from within like a packed explosive detonating instantly. Flesh and blood sprayed into the air as the dense bone disintegrated into thousands of jagged shards, whistling outward like lethal shrapnel. Within a single second, half of its arm was reduced to charred fragments by its own rebounded strength. The colossal recoil did not stop at its limb. It surged through the shoulder blade, systematically obliterating the creature's internal organs. Only then did the black-armored bear unleash a final agonized roar of pure despair. Its massive frame was sent hurtling backward like a tattered sack, crashing violently into the spirit field 2 meters away. It crushed a wide swathe of spirit rice, convulsing uncontrollably in the mire. Its sole remaining left claw scraped desperately against the earth, while its maw vomited forth a dark bile mixed with visceral fragments. After less than 10 breaths of agonizing struggle, it grew still, becoming a lifeless husk. Throughout the entire ordeal, Yi Chenzhou, still lying amidst the heap of corpses, did not so much as twitch an eyebrow. To him, that devastating strike felt like nothing more than a gentle nudge against his back. Not a single scratch marked his skin. Instead, the ill-fated beast had effectively orchestrated its own demise. Yi Chenzhou resumed his facade of death, patiently waiting for the sex formation team to arrive and clear the battlefield. The bear's carcass, resting a mere 2 meters away, served as the perfect natural concealment. The surrounding demonic beasts, having witnessed the horrific end of their kin, felt a primal surge of terror. One by one, they instinctively steered clear of the area where Yi Chenzhou lay. They turned back to hunt down the other laborers who were still scattering in all directions. After the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, a series of ear-piercing whistles suddenly echoed through the sky over Bitter Peak. Over a dozen dazzling glints from flying swords streaked across the heavens like meteors, carrying a chilling aura as they came to a steady halt in midair. Leading them was a deacon of the Intersect Formation Hall, dressed in a black robe with gold trim. The overwhelming pressure of the 7th-level Foundation building realm was released without restraint, suppressing the frenzied low-level spirit beasts below and forcing them to collapse onto the ground, trembling in fear. He let out a thunderous shout, ordering the total annihilation of the beasts. Leaving none alive, the dozen disciples of the formation squad behind him simultaneously performed their sword gestures, their flying swords transforming into a series of afterimages, weaving back and forth across Bitter Peak. One by one, the massive heads of the spirit beasts fell to the ground. To the laborers, these beasts were like gods of death, but before the Intersect elites, they were as fragile as common vegetables. In less than the time it takes to drink half a cup of tea, over 10 beasts had been slaughtered. The leading deacon coldly ordered the area to be cleared, the wounded to be treated, and the beast carcasses to be collected. Beast cores and hides were to be delivered to the sect treasury. Clear the scene, treat the wounded, and gather the beast remains. The beast cores and hides must be sent to the sect treasury. Having spoken, he stepped onto his flying sword to patrol other areas. The formation disciples retracted their flying swords and landed in the muddy, blood-stained spirit fields with looks of utter disdain. A tall, thin disciple remarked, "These laborers are far too weak. A few random first-rank spirit beasts were enough to kill so many of them." Kicking the corpses aside as they walked, the two continued their conversation. They soon reached the pile of corpses where Chenzhou was located. The tall disciple suddenly stopped, pointing out the carcass of a black-armored bear to his companion. The two crouched beside the massive corpse, observing the right side of its body, which had completely exploded, and looked at each other, unable to comprehend how it could have possibly shocked itself to death. The tall disciple used his scabbard to poke at the shattered remains. How strange. Could this bear have gone so berserk that it caused its own spiritual energy to detonate? Its entire right arm and half of its chest have been reduced to dust. This is a truly peculiar way to die. Another fat disciple stood at a distance, pinching his nose. Why do you care how it died? When low-level first-rank beasts go mad, they are naturally prone to key deviation. Hurry and register these, harvest the useful materials, and let's move out. The two quickly drew their skinning knives, harvesting the hide and extracting the intact monster core from the black-armored bear. The stout disciple even stuffed the intact left bear paw into his spatial bag, planning to make a feast of it tonight. Just as the two were about to board their flying swords and head to the next area, a faint, extremely weak groan suddenly echoed from within the pile of corpses on the ground. Chenzhou opened his eyes at that precise moment. His expression was dazed, and his entire body trembled violently like a leaf in the wind. Scrambling on all fours, he crawled backward through the mud, shouting in terror as he retreated, "Don't eat me, my meat is sour. It doesn't taste good at all." His display of sheer soul-shattering terror was more convincing than that of someone truly driven mad by fear. The tall, thin disciple glanced at him and let out a cold snort. "Enough, stop your shouting. The demonic beasts are all dead. You are lucky indeed to have survived by being buried under these corpses. Get lost and head to the steward's hall to collect some medicine." With that, the two didn't bother sparing him another glance, transforming into streaks of sword light and flying away. Slumped in the mud, Chenzhou watched the sword light vanish in the distance, and the terror on his face instantly vanished. He calmly wiped the grime from his face and stood up, dusting himself off. The beast riot had raged for half an hour before finally being quelled. Bitter Labor Peak suffered heavy casualties. Corpses littered the ground, and clearing the area alone took an entire day. By early the next morning, Steward Zhao Tishan's expression was grimmer than if he were mourning his own kin. Dozens of miscellaneous disciples under his charge had perished, and half of the spirit fields had been trampled into ruin. The higher-ups would undoubtedly hold him accountable for this disaster to appease the masses. The outer sect elder made a rare exception and issued an emergency allowance. Chenzhou blended into the line of survivors waiting for their compensation, intentionally disheveling his hair and walking with a pronounced limp. His eyes were hollow and vacant as he constantly muttered nonsense about a giant bear. When it was his turn, the deacon distributing the funds flipped through the register and looked up at his miserable state. He was recorded as a survivor of the spirit field disaster, suffering from extreme psychological trauma. He was granted 10 low-grade spirit stones, 2 bottles of blood-stanching. Chenzhou extended a trembling hand, clutching the money pouch tightly in his palm, offering profuse thanks before retreating. 10 low-grade spirit stones were an absolute fortune for a mere labor disciple. Under normal circumstances, toiling for an entire month would only yield a few pounds of inferior spirit stones. Chenzhou did not hesitate for a moment. Once the money was in hand, he slipped away from the bitter labor peak and headed straight for the market at Mount Qian. Although he now possessed monstrous attributes, his physical foundation remained that of a weak first-level qi refining cultivator. If he failed to thoroughly refine these attributes into the very depths of his marrow, he might face disaster should he encounter a true master in the future. If such an opponent cast a spell, his exterior might remain unharmed, but his internal organs could be shattered by the shockwaves. He needed a comprehensive reconstruction of his physical body. Arriving at the market, Chenzhou went directly to the medicine street, specializing in low-level body tempering materials. He generously placed 10 low-grade spirit stat stones upon the counter, requesting 5 bottles of the strongest blazing tiger essence blood, 10 packets of bone-breaking grass, and 10 packets of iron skin immortal grass. Every ingredient had to be at least 5 years of age. The shopkeeper looked at the youth dressed in tattered labor disciple robes. He was momentarily stunned, but adhering to the principle that only a fool refuses profit, he smiled and packed the items before handing them over. With his materials secured, Chenzhou skirted along the walls and ran without stopping, returning to his room, which was fortified by over 50 layers of defensive arrays. He bolted the door shut and moved the wooden bed aside, revealing a 3-meter-deep tunnel hidden beneath. He leaped into the passage, carefully sweeping aside the poison powder and wooden spikes he had previously laid as traps. From his spatial bag, he pulled out a large wooden tub he had scavenged from somewhere. Placing it in the center of the tunnel, he emptied the 10 packets of bone-breaking grass and iron skin immortal grass into it. Next, he added the 5 bottles of blazing tiger essence blood. Using a fire starter, he ignited a blaze beneath the wooden tub. Before long, the dark red medicinal fluid within the tub began to boil violently. As it bubbled, a pungent, nauseating stench of blood and medicinal herbs filled the tunnel. Any ordinary first-level qi-refining cultivator who jumped into such a concentrated medicinal bath would surely have their blood vessels instantly ruptured by the violent medicinal energy. Yet Yi Chenzhou remained undeterred. He quickly stripped off his outer robes and even set aside his armor, which was inscribed with damage-reflecting runes. Taking a deep breath, he plunged into the seething medicinal liquid. Immediately, it felt as though countless red-hot needles were frantically piercing through his every pore. The violent energy of the blazing tiger's essence blood surged through his pores and flooded into his bloodstream. Yi Chenzhou's eyes bulged as he roared within his mind, commanding the system panel to funnel every available attribute point into his bone marrow. The system acknowledged the command and initiated a deep-level reconstruction, issuing a stark warning of the agonizing pain that would follow. Please remain conscious. The boiling medicinal bath will serve as the optimal catalyst and buffer. The attributes of hardness, poison resistance, density, and damage reflection began to fuse completely with his bones. Yi Chenzhou endured the reconstruction of the medicinal bath, remaining incapacitated for 2 days and 2 nights before finally recovering. The violent medicinal energy of the blood essence was forcibly crushed by the system, ensuring every drop was absorbed into his marrow and flesh. On the surface, he still appeared to be a lowly, emaciated first-stage qi refinement handyman with a sallow complexion. In reality, however, his physical density had increased to a level that would make anyone shudder in fear. The 3 major attributes, density, hardness, and poison resistance, had been perfectly integrated. If he were tasked with repairing the 10,000 stone steps of the rear mountain now, he wouldn't even need to use his hands. A simple headbutt would be enough to bring down half the mountain itself. Late at night, thick clouds obscured the moon, leaving not a single star in sight. The forest surrounding the outskirts of the rear mountain's bitter peak was shrouded in pitch-black darkness. Even the chirping of insects had fallen into an eerie silence. A figure draped in a black cloak stumbled and rolled out from the thickets, collapsing into the mud and gasping for breath. Immediately, a repulsive foul stench began to permeate the air. He gritted his teeth and cursed. The mad dogs from the heaven-profound sex disciplinary hall were relentless in their pursuit. Under the faint moonlight, half of his face was visible, covered in dried, purplish-black stains. A deep sword wound on his right flank exposed the bone. The edges were sizzling with black smoke, preventing the injury from closing. He was a demonic cultivator known as the Crimson Demon. With a cultivation at the 8th stage of qi refinement, he had infiltrated the territory of the heaven-profound sect, intending to harvest the essence of outer disciples to further his wicked cultivation. However, the moment he acted, he was caught red-handed by the elites of the disciplinary hall. 3 flying swords had pursued him relentlessly for an entire day and night. Having exhausted all his trump cards and sustained grievous injuries, he barely managed to escape to the desolate heights of the bitter peak. His demonic ki was severely depleted, and he could no longer suppress his wounds. If he did not find a blood bag to nourish himself, he would undoubtedly meet his end here today. His bloodshot triangular eyes fixed upon the nearby handyman quarters like a starving wolf. In his current pathetic state, escaping the heaven-profound sect's great protecting array was impossible. He desperately needed a scapegoat, someone whose essence he could drain to heal his wounds before draping his black cloak over them. By faking a fatal self-destruction, he would execute a golden cicada shedding its skin maneuver to facilitate his escape. Sichma's gaze swept across the series of dilapidated wooden shacks on Deep Conehot Peak. Those with high cultivation levels were out of the question, as they would easily cause a disturbance. Houses located too close to one another were also unsuitable, as they could easily trigger chaos. Suddenly, his vision locked onto the most remote and derelict wooden shack in the corner. That was precisely the residence of Deep Than Shao. Sichma let out a cold sneer, licking his parched, cracked lips. The dilapidated shack was riddled with holes, looking like an abandoned ruin that had been neglected for 800 years. The inhabitant was undoubtedly a bottom-tier trash, likely unable to even afford spirit rice. His figure flickered like a night owl, gliding close to the ground, silently creeping toward the outside of the shack. He did not rush to push the door open, instead releasing his divine sense to sweep across the surroundings. There wasn't the slightest ripple of any formation array. It was merely an ordinary wooden house, impoverished beyond measure. However, the more than 50 layers of qi-concealing formations Deep Than Shao had inscribed completely masked the spiritual fluctuations of the solid wall formation within. To the eyes of a late-stage qi condensation cultivator like Sichma, this was nothing more than an utterly unremarkable broken room. Avoiding any sound from the door, he reached into his robes and pulled out a crumpled wall-passing talisman, slapping it onto himself. Instantly, his entire body transformed into a faint black shadow, sliding through the cracks of the door like flowing water. While the 50 layers of solid wall formations could withstand physical strikes, they were powerless against this type of intangible escape art. Deep Than Shao stepped forward, looking down at Sichma, who lay dead on the floor, his eyes still wide with shock. Leaving the corpse of a late-stage qi condensation demonic cultivator in his room would undoubtedly bring immense trouble. The scent of blood was too thick. It would surely attract the stewards or the formation patrol by morning. Without hesitation, he reached out with his right hand, pressing it against Sichma's corpse and commanding the system to extract. The control panel appeared, detecting a high-concentration mixture of spiritual energy and blood essence. Extraction in progress, target deceased. Impurities were being removed and essence refined as the blue lotus light of the control panel flickered. The 2 mangled halves of the corpse on the floor, along with the pooling blood, The ruptured organs and even the black robes he wore began to weather and disintegrate at a speed visible to the naked eye. In less than a few moments, a living being had completely vanished, leaving not even a single drop of blood behind. In its place, a handful of dark red powder remained in deep Chenzhou's palm. This powder radiated an incredibly dense and pure herbal spiritual energy with no trace of the scent of blood remaining. This was the very essence condensed from the entire cultivation base and flesh of an 8th-rank Qi condensation cultivator. Deep Chenzhou casually tucked Sichma's withered storage bag into his robes, then found a piece of scrap cloth. Next, he swiftly lifted the shattered wall plank, using mud and iron nails to restore it to its original state, casually layering several concealing formations over it. As he finished his work, a streak of white light just began to emerge on the distant horizon. The following day, Ye Chenzhou appeared punctually at the spirit fields for his watering duties. As for the 8th stage Qi refinement demonic cultivator from the night before, he had already been refined into a handful of Qi-rich fertilizer, buried deep within the spirit soil. Several months later, within the spirit fields of Kufeng Peak, only the few acres under Ye Chenzhou's sole care showed an extraordinary growth. The spirit rice stalks were as thick as a man's arm. Resembling sturdy saplings, their golden grains were plump and glistening, saturated with spiritual energy so dense it was almost palpable, nearly condensing into liquid. Steward Zhao Tishan stood upon the ridge, gazing at the bountiful harvest, his face quivering with delight. Breaking his usual cold demeanor, he clapped Ye Chenzhou on the shoulder while tossing him a fragment of a spirit stone. "You have done well. The yield from these fields not only compensates for previous losses, but has also earned me great prestige with my superiors. From now on, you shall remain stationed at these fields. If anyone dares to trouble you, simply speak my name." Ye Chenzhou accepted the spirit stone fragment with both hands, bowing with a fawning smile. "You flatter me. I am grateful for your patronage, steward. I have no grand ambitions. I am content simply tending to the earth." Only after Zhao Tishan had walked away with his hands behind his back, humming a tune, did Ye Chenzhou slowly straighten his spine and casually tuck the spirit stone fragment into his pouch. Picking up a long-handled ladle, he scooped a generous amount of spirit spring water and slowly poured it over the sturdiest rice stalk at the center of the field. Deep beneath the soil, a faint trace of dark red flickered, discernible only to him. It was the final remnant of the demonic cultivator's origin essence. But the moment this aura emerged, it was suppressed by a heavy, profound force radiating from beneath Ye Chenzhou's feet. It was utterly crushed and subdued in an instant, transforming entirely into nutrients for his spirit blade. Ye Chenzhou sighed inwardly. Fertilizer from an 8th-level Qi condensation demonic cultivator was indeed potent, but it was a pity his supply was nearly exhausted. Shouldering his water ladle and brushing the mud from his hands, he casually summoned the system interface in his mind. Looking at the exaggerated stats, enough to make even high-level cultivators question their very existence, a satisfied smile played across his lips. Over toward the front mountain, the bronze bell tolled once more as several brilliant streaks of light swept across the sky above Bitter Peak. These were the intersect geniuses, riding their flying swords and traveling in groups. A new secret realm had appeared, signaling the start of more bloodshed and slaughter. Ye Chenzhou glanced up at those dazzling sword lights in the sky and curled his lip, devoid of even a hint of envy. Let them fight. Once they have finished risking their lives, I will take my sack to the edge of the battlefield to scavenge the remains and extract their attributes. The waters of this cultivation world are far too deep, and the winds are far too treacherous. Ye Chenzhou isn't going anywhere. He would remain here, farming on this windswept summit of Bitter Peak, quietly amassing a great fortune, laying low until he is unrivaled under the heavens. Turning away, Ye Chenzhou hummed a nameless tune and strolled back toward his wooden shack, which was protected by over 50 layers of formation arrays. The sunset stretched his slender shadow across the most secluded path of Bitter Peak. No one spared a glance for this unremarkable laborer, nor the faint smile flickering on his lips. No one knew that on this desolate peak at the lowest tier of the sect, a monster was quietly and steadily coming into its own. The story